The nonprofit MBA purpose is to provide new business insights and fresh creative ideas for executive directors and their teams that will help them improve their organization. Here is your host, Stephen Halasnik.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Halasnik. I will be your host for today's nonprofit MBA podcast, as I have been for the past 6 years. I kind of got to change that saying I'm the host because everyone knows I'm the host. But, and for those of you who don't know me and a lot of first-time listeners, I'm sure, I'm the co-founder of Financing Solutions. And for the last 13 years, Financing Solutions has been the number one leading provider of lines of credit to small nonprofits in the United States. And yes, there is a company that focuses on lines of credit for nonprofits. Listen, in the past, it still is. It's next to impossible for a line of credit to get a nonprofit line of credit from a bank. And that's exactly what we do. We are actually using our own money, and we've been doing it for a long time. And it's just really helpful for nonprofits to have a line of credit. So if you're interested, just visit our website at nonprofitmbapodcast.com, and you can learn more about us. You can apply. It takes 2 minutes, and you'll find out if you what you qualify for, and if you don't, we'll tell you exactly why. And today we have a sponsor for the podcast. Arrays Fast Fund Online is accounting software that's made specifically for small to medium-sized nonprofits. It's a great product, so much better than using QuickBooks. Or if you're still using Excel, it's time to move on. It's not expensive, and it's really a great product. And if you're interested in learning more about Arrays, please visit their website at arrays.com, ARAIZE.com. Today, I'm very excited and happy to be speaking with Juan Taveras from DEI ProFinder. And DEI, because I asked Juan when he got on what that stands for. It was not bright of me, but it stands for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion ProFinder. So we're going to be talking about that today, I'm sure, too. And so today's topic is how to create people-centered and mission-aligned cultures for your nonprofit. Before we get into that discussion, I'd like to introduce Juan. Juan Taveras is a people-oriented human resources and diversity, equity, and inclusion professional with 17 plus years of experience designing, orchestrating, and championing inclusive workplace initiatives that foster psychological safety, strengthens organizational alignment, and increases engagement. Juan, welcome to today's Nonprofit MBA podcast.
Thank you for having me, Stephen.
So when people bring you on an assignment, typically what is the purpose?
Yeah, great question. So I have the vast majority of my experience is in the HR space. And then I've done some diversity, equity, and inclusion work over the last 3 to 5 years. But my focus is on developing strategy. So I when someone reaches out to me, they either and why I'm excited to be talking to you, because I do a lot of work with nonprofits, and 13 of the years I've spent in the workforce were as a nonprofit leader. But they're either ready for their first HR hire. They're growing and need someone to come in and set up those initial HR processes and the foundation for that department. Or these are the more interesting projects, as you might imagine, are the turnaround jobs, right? They're either in a hyper growth phase and they can't keep up with it, so the current systems are just not sustaining or not at the scale where they need to be, or they've had some trouble with HR's, again, systems or processes, and they need someone to come in and just kind of fix and clean things up. So that's where I spend most of my time. And then with DEI ProFinder, I also support with the development of diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. I don't do direct service in that space because I have the directory that I rely on. So I have a network of DEI consultants and trainers and professionals that I tap for specific projects related to my clients' needs.
I get you. Cool. So, you know, when we talk about today's subject of is how to create people-centered and mission-aligned cultures for or nonprofits, it's my guess is that if executive directors are focusing, if they understand the value of creating people-centered and mission-aligned cultures, they're well ahead of 90% of the other companies out there or organizations out there. Um, why should one create people-centered and mission-aligned
Mhm.
culture? Why should they?
Yeah, that's sort of the business case for it. So I'll say the more obvious ones, right? Are you have when your workforce is values driven and mission aligned, you get more out of them, and not to say that people are widgets or things that we're trying to um, you know just get more out of, but it's more about uh, their desire to be more for you and for your organization. There's an alignment that goes beyond I need a job or this is a paycheck, right? There is a desire to support the mission. They have a personal connection to the work that you're doing, and they see themselves in the future of that organization. So you ultimately get, which comes with higher retention, less more stability over the long term. Folks that stick around, especially in the nonprofit sector, as things things change quickly, and depending on one year to the next, and funding and all that stuff, it's incredibly beneficial to have folks that have been there for a long time and sort of know the history and the story. So focusing on those things, values and code and the mission aligned culture help in those areas.
When I know this would be, and it depends on the size of the organizations you're working with, but how many times do you go into a nonprofit organization and find that they have not defined their purpose, their mission, their culture? How many times do you see that groundwork has not been done?
Great question. So, and I have to think about this really quickly. It would only be, in my experience, maybe a handful of cases where they haven't had that.
25% of the time, 10% of the time.
I would say, 10% of the time, maybe.
10% of the time.
Here's what I would add, though: 80% of the time, that is in place, but it's not it's not a living part of the organization, right? So it's something
that's a good. So 80% of the time, the executive director has done that work, maybe with the board, and it's collecting dust. Yep. And they don't review it. It doesn't become part of the culture. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so if we just jumped ahead a little bit, that's good to hear that it's 80%. Now, the organizations you're dealing with, I'm sure that they're more than $5 million in revenue.
The majority of them, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So my guess is that anything and anything under 5 million revenue, that 80% number of people who have those three things done drops to maybe 10% or less. And so, I think, when we're talking about this subject matter today of people-centered and mission-aligned cultures, it's by far the number one step for smaller nonprofits is you got to define your mission, your purpose, and your culture, right?
Absolutely. So you mentioned earlier how important it is for nonprofits to have a line of credit, and I couldn't agree more. Because nonprofits are businesses. You need the money to secure the money to make sure that you keep the engine going. But next, in my perspective, the next most important thing is your people, and what kind of talent are you attracting? What kind of talent do you want to attract? And in order to be clear on that, you have to be really clear about what your mission is, what your what's the stake in the ground, right? That you're putting in around the work that you do, and then what are the values that ultimately will create the culture that's going to sustain this nonprofit long term. And skipping that step early on leads to a lot of issues. I talk to leaders that are like, oh, that'll come later. Right now, I just need to get XYZ in place, and I'm like, well, you can do that, but it's going to hurt you.
Yeah, let me tell you too. If someone were to respond that way to me as an executive director, to say that to me, I'd be like, I'm assuming what you're saying to me, Mrs. or Mr. Executive Director, is that fundraising is the number one thing that you need to be working on right now,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So the answer would be yes. I'd say is you can't fundraise. You can't make a sales pitch, quote unquote, if you don't understand the organization's purpose, mission, culture. So that if I was to start a brand new nonprofit, which there's good potential I will be, it's the number one thing I was going to do. That's the number one thing I would do before I open the doors. I would say that, because I need to be able to tell the people that I'm going to be raising money from, the employees are going to be working for, or even where I spend my time, what our purpose is, right? And I'm saying is that's not something you do on a napkin over a day. This is like something you really have to put a lot of thought into before you actually open the door. And I'm going to tell you, with my businesses that I've had done, which I've had opened several, I've done that before I opened the door. I said, this is going to be our culture, our mission, our purpose, and this is what we're trying to achieve. So, fair.
I love that. Yeah. I and to your point, it's not something that happens in one day, or this is a lot of mindset and heart set work, right? You have to figure out, because this culture has to, or your values and your mission, it will eventually outlive you, right? So it has to be your North Star. Like what is it that you're driving towards? And then once you're really clear on that, then the funders and the people that you need to make that happen will more easily align with that trajectory, as opposed to, to use your example, you're pitching something, you need money to do what? What is it that you're trying to achieve? Yeah.
Yeah. I think too, like nonprofits honestly have a much easier way of answering those questions about mission, purpose, culture, those things than a for-profit business does. It's much easier. A for-profit business wants to incorporate the human elements of what they do into their mission, culture, and so it's much harder for a for-profit, but for a nonprofit, it's really more built in. The difference between a for-profit and a nonprofit that a nonprofit does better at is the measurements. It's very simplistic. It's, if you're running a good business, it's about making money, because if you don't make money, you can't, you really can't survive. That's the same thing for a nonprofit too. Nonprofits, I think sometimes measuring things, is much harder.
Right.
When I think, if I were, to look at this again and say, mission, purpose, culture, how do we measure ourselves? That's what a nonprofit needs to really work on. And that's hard. I think the measurement part is hard.
I agree.
Right.
Yeah. So often we're nonprofits are measuring impact, right? Both internal and external. And there's a lot of, it's not tangible. It's squishy. But you're absolutely right. And I think if when you have a clear mission and a clear set of values, and you're hiring people that are aligned with those two things, then the measuring, there's some basic stuff in the HR world that you can measure, like retention rates and One of my favorite tools is the NPS, right? The Net Promoter Score. Like, how likely is it that someone on your team will recommend working here to a friend or a family member? That's huge. And anyway, so there are things you can do, but to your point, it's a lot more challenging in the nonprofit sector.
Is there a good book? Like if someone said, okay, Stephen Wan, I buy into what you're saying, that I need to really define all these things. Is there a good book that you would recommend that someone reads?
That's a great question. I would have to think about it. The first book that comes to mind, it's less has more to do with leadership. It's Managing to Change the World. It's by the Management Center. And they're based out of New York City. And it's a book I discovered, not that I discovered it, so an executive leader that I used to work with gave to me as a gift many years ago. And it has, I've learned a lot from it, and I still reference it today. So it's not, it's really about how do you show up as a nonprofit leader, wanting to, again, have the greatest impact. And what I like about the book is that it has some very concrete strategies for conversations that you need to have, the systems that need to be in place, and like your one-on-one check-ins with your staff members, or the performance review process, et cetera. And they have a ton of free tools on their website. So it's themanagementcenter.org. And the book is Managing to Change the World.
So going back to our top, thank you for that. Going back to our topic, which is how to create people-centered and mission-aligned cultures. So could you give us 3 things that you would recommend in order to do that?
Yeah. The first one and the most important is what we've already talked about, taking the time, even as painful as it might be, to prioritize this work up front, but taking the time to develop a clear mission and a set of core values, right? And if you already have a team, it's not too late. Like I say, we've been saying that it's great if you would have this as a foundation even before you got started. But if you are already, in operating and you have a board, still do this exercise. And even if you have a mission statement, like revisit it and take time to ensure that everyone is clear on what it is that you're trying to achieve and how you're doing it. Because this is another thing I see in the nonprofit sector, is there are a lot of organizations tackling the same problem, right? Or the same societal issue. What makes you different? What is your theory of change, if you will? Like how are you addressing this problem in a unique way that leverages your unique expertise and your unique strengths and sort of the collection of people that you've got around you, right? And make sure that is represented in your mission statement and your values, because you need that buy-in from everyone that's around you. That's number one. Number two, I would say something I coach my leaders on often is hire slow and fire fast. Oftentimes we do the opposite, right? And I've been there. I've been a victim, not a victim, but I've practiced the opposite of that, where I get desperate for the need for resources or support, and I hire someone who, on paper looks great and they're ready to start right away. But I didn't do my due diligence. I didn't take the time to check references or do a formal interview or whatever. And then it turns out they don't work out, and we just lose so much time and energy in that. So taking your time to be hire intentionally, because like we said earlier, if you have the right people on the bus and they're aligned with your mission and your values, then they're going to add so much more to your organization and likely will stay long-term, and then help you also become an advocate for recruiting more people. And then the third thing I would say is around communication. This is something I also see nonprofit leaders struggle with. They have a team, and their teams have roles and responsibilities, and they sort of there's this assumption that things are just going to work out because look at the org chart. Everything is everything's there. Everyone's in place, but you really have to have more communication channels than you think is normal, right? Like it's up and down and sideways communication, so that everyone is constantly aligned and knows where the ball is on the court and who's moving it, etc. So So building in those practices, one tool that has become really popular over the last few years that I actually really enjoy is Slack. And for nonprofits, there's a free version. So a really a great way to engage your team regularly outside of email. And there's an app. Anyway, so you can be in communication on the go, especially if you are a remote team, or if you have a team that travels often for fundraising events and those kinds of things, staying in touch in that way, but ensuring that you're communicating often and regularly.
Yeah, I think too, I mean, going back to what we're talking about with once you've identified the culture, and we talked about, that it collects dust, that you need to set an agenda for once every quarter to review that with your team. It's simple enough when you're in a meeting, you're in a huddle, you could say, it's been 3 months. Let's review what our culture is. Let's review what our mission is, our purpose, how we measure ourselves. Let's review that. Any questions? There's any problems with this? Are there instances where we didn't follow this that we can talk about?
Mm-hmm.
Right. You just need to keep that dust off that thing, because believe it or not, from my experience, that document, those areas are the key to your success.
Yep.
I'm a firm believer of something called, I call it high probability activities. And the more you do of things that are going to lead to success, the more you do those things, the less of a chance you have of failure. And number one is creating a culture, having the document. Number two is making sure everybody understands it and lives by it. Number three, making it a live editable document where you update it. Mm-hmm. I think that those are important things to the success of your organizations. Is that something, Juan, that you would agree to as well?
Absolutely. And I would go, so I love keeping it alive as much as you can. But as the executive director, leveraging it in all of your communication, open any all staff email with like a reminder of what our mission is, or share wins from your work and tie it back to your mission. So those constant reminders are incredibly important, because it happens. We make the assumption that, oh, well, there it is on our website. It's in our handbook and they got it during their onboarding. So I'm sure they know what we do, but it's going beyond like memorizing the statement and to what I'm hearing you say is bringing it to life every day, and as much as possible anyway, in your organization. So
yeah, I think, like Elian mentioned, nonprofits have an inherent built-in, the people who work there believe in the mission of the people that they're serving, right? But if you can add to that they also feel like they're working at a great place, that's well run, that's organized, it's another dimension to reduce turnover. It had always been said to me that I have read that turnover in an organization, if you think turnover at your organization is happening because you can't pay well, you are sadly mistaken. Turnover occurs because people are unhappy with the company, with the work that they're usually it's because it's poorly run. So turnover is a reflection of management. If you have good management, if good processes and procedures, people will accept less money. Yeah. Right? Because they're afraid if they go somewhere else that they're going to lose that. So they'll consider it a gift that they are working for a company that's well organized, that they treat people fairly, that they're included in decisions. And if you're making the mistake right now saying, well, and so what would you say, Juan, is acceptable turnover? How much? What percentage?
In the nonprofit sector, I say a healthy turnover hovers between 15 to 20%.
Wow, that's even higher than I thought.
Year over year.
Yeah. I would have guessed 5%, that if you are below 5%, your company is really doing well.
The smaller that number, absolutely.
Yeah.
But and I also throw in here It depends on the size of your organization. I
Yeah, I
work
know.
mostly with
Yeah.
organizations that are 100 plus staff members. So
Mhm.
those are the numbers that I see. But yeah, I completely agree. If you can
Yeah,
keep
yeah.
that number lower,
Yeah, I
that's
mean, if you have 3 employees and you lose one, you lost 30% of your
yeah, yeah,
employees, it's, and believe me, it hurts when you lose somebody, often it takes you losing a couple people before you realize that it's your organization
Mhm.
and your management style that's the problem, not the pay.
Yep,
But
yep,
everyone's going to default to pay. I'm leaving here because you're just not paying me enough, and it just doesn't. If you have a good I've seen people who pay people less because they have a great organization, you
yeah.
know. Um, so what else in this regards to inclusiveness and mission aligned cultures and inclusiveness nowadays is such a should be it's like the word of the year. Like maybe I'm a little behind the time. Maybe it's been that way 3 years ago, but let's use that in this context.
Yeah.
How would you do inclusion in in a nonprofit?
Yeah, great question. So a couple of things that I do in my practice when it comes to and more broadly diversity, equity, and inclusion work, but when I'm coaching leaders on how to be more inclusive, it's about creating spaces or team environments where everyone can feel comfortable expressing their thoughts and opinions and sharing their ideas, whether they're uh, against the grain, right? Like if they're sharing something that is actually opposes some a leader's thought or opinion, that is okay. Like the idea of inclusion is being open to the varying perspectives that are in the room at all times, because and this is why I bring in the diversity piece, right? A lot of people think when they hear the word diversity, they think race or gender or sexual orientation, but there's so much more to our uniqueness that we can't see, that is invisible. I often use the analogy of the iceberg, right, floating in the water. We see this much of it, but there's a massive piece under the water that we cannot see, and that's how we are as humans in our identities and how we show up to work every day. So as a leader, you want to foster an environment where you want to be curious about that individual, the invisibility, right? Like it's like, well, I want your real thoughts on this strategy. Like we're launching a new fundraising campaign. What do you really think? Don't hold back, right? So and it's one thing to say that, right, to invite the individual, but another thing to create an environment where that happens naturally. And you do that by leading by example. So, express your own doubt or your own questions about this. Get vulnerable with your team, and they will reciprocate that, right? They're like, oh well, if you are also having questions about this, then I feel more comfortable expressing my own concerns, etc. So that's what I think about when we think about inclusion. It's about that safety, creating safe spaces where difference can exist and can be leveraged to make the organization better.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of a time when I was running. I built this one company, and I I really didn't know much about the field we went into. I just typically am good at building companies, and so I would have these. I was very young, and I would have my employees, coming to me and asking me questions, and I didn't know the answers
Mm.
because it was a field I really didn't know that much. So I was very young at the time, and so I would get really, really frustrated. Um, and I would kind of, kind of, I would get really frustrated because I didn't know the answers, and so I kind of would, dance around it. But then I got to a point where I was like, I learned enough about the industry that I was okay to say to my employees, I really don't know. I don't
Mm.
know the answer. Let's go find it together.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So it's weird when you are building a nonprofit and you don't know all the answers and you feel like you have to lie about it because you're supposed to be the one who's the leader who knows everything about it. And yet, I learned that once I learned what I didn't know, I felt comfortable in saying, I really don't know. Let's go figure it out together. And by doing that, the people who worked for me were more endeared to me. They were like, oh, well, he's like a real person, and okay, he doesn't have all the answers. I don't expect him to have every answer that's out there. But I am a fast learner. And that's what I think everybody else should be out there as well. So I think it's similar to what you're talking about. Showing them that you're a human being.
Yes.
One of the other things I learned too is sometimes I learned to take my one person out to lunch every month, because then I got to know them personally and they got to know me personally. And it kind of changed, how they would give me feedback, because I didn't realize how many of them are scared to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, just tell me the truth. I'll take it,
Yeah.
So you find the same thing?
I do. And so I'm so glad you shared that example, because it's so important to build those relationships, and creating that opportunity for people to share more of themselves and to learn more about you. So that's that two-way street, because that power dynamic, to your point about being afraid, that's always there. That even it's in our unconscious. I don't know how many people are thinking about it actively all the time. I'm sure there are, especially if, in the current volatile workspace, but it's definitely in our unconscious. Like, oh, this individual has the power to eliminate my role or take my job away. So there's this risk management that's constantly going on. But to your point, if you humanize yourself as a leader to them, if you demonstrate to them that you don't have all the answers, you're not perfect, you're not expecting perfection, that we're going to do this together, right? And that those individuals were hired for a reason, for their strengths, for the value that they bring to the organization, for their mission alignment, then there's they start to see themselves more as a collective, right? As a group, and not individuals that need to perform and have all the answers, etc. So you start to build this team camaraderie that just gives you so much more in the end.
Yeah, and I'll tell you the truth. And once I started doing stuff like that too, it made my work funner.
Yeah.
It's so much about people, life, right? We're social creatures. Yes. I think this whole experiment with remote work, and it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. You see this huge increase of depression going on in the United States. You see remote work going way up. There's a correlation there. Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting how do you create a culture when people can't have those open, fun conversations over coffee, over a water cooler, when they walk in the first 15 minutes, it's like, what did you do this past weekend? I don't know. I'm too far removed from it right now. Very small, but we don't have a lot of employees, so it's a little bit different. Past companies that I've had, 100 plus people, we didn't work remotely. Mm-hmm. So, it is an interesting world right now. And I think there's a lot of answers where you can use Zoom and to engage your employees. It just takes a lot more proactive work. Right. Agreed.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that you can still do it. It's not the same, to your point, and it definitely does require more proactivity and intentionality. So I've seen organizations use, virtual platforms like Slack, or there's a number of new team building platforms that have come out over the last few years. But you have a team that's dispersed, it's remote, different time zones. There's a lot of moving parts that need to be figured out. But I also believe that the attempt goes a long way. Like, if as an employee, if I know that I have the opportunity to engage informally, like in a coffee chats kind of environment with peers, even if I can't leverage it all the time, but I know that it's there, it helps.
Yeah, and listen, I had a guest on once who I always raise this point about this remote work because it's very interesting to me about culture and remote work and creating a company. But he said something that it's so true. He said it's not going to, employees want it. It's not going to go back. They're not saying, employees are not saying, I want to be in the office 5 days a week. Right. It's really not happening. Yeah. So, maybe they want a hybrid. Some of them, I would say majority of them want to work from home. Right. I don't know. Are you seeing that too?
Oh yeah. 100%.
Yeah. So they all want to work 100% from home. I'm sorry. A large majority want to work 100% from home. You have a few people who say, I want to come to the office twice a week. Right. And you have almost very, very few people. Is it fair enough to say? It's like the old timers like me who say no, I want to be in the office 5 days a week.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I have a couple of clients that have physical spaces, and they have their regulars. They have their 2 or 3 staff members that show up every day and have their routine and enjoy that. They need that for their work style. One other thing I'll throw in here that's been making this remote work stuff really interesting is there's of the people that want to work 100% remotely. Now there are these more and more requests for working from anywhere in the world.
I get it. Yeah. From anywhere in the world, or people who want to get out of their house, go to an office that's near them, like a work, what's it called? Not workspace, shared workplace.
Oh yeah, like a co-working space.
Are you seeing that too, where people say, I don't want to work out of my house. I want to get out, but I don't want the hour commute, or I want to live in another part of the world, but I want to get out of my house. Are you seeing that more prevalent?
Not as much. I have seen that. Not as much, but yeah, it's interesting because then they're basically asking for their employer to pay for
the
co-working
rent.
space.
And so what's the purpose of someone living so far away? I guess to keep them. I mean, I own a large office building and I have one guy in there right now who that's why he's a salesperson, but he wants an office. So they pay for that office for him. So I do see it firsthand. Yeah. All right. Well, listen, it was a great conversation today, Juan. I really enjoyed it. I'd like to really thank Juan Taveras from DEI ProFinder for coming on today's podcast. If you like today's podcast, please feel free to share it with a friend and also subscribe on your favorite podcasting app. The Nonprofit MBA podcast is in the top 1% of podcasts listened to for nonprofits, according to the apps. So, we really appreciate that. Part of it is that we have a 5-star rating. And so that really helps us. And if you do like today's podcast or any of the other ones, please give us a 5-star rating. And if you're looking for a line of credit for your nonprofit or just to learn more about it, please go to our website, nonprofitmbapodcast.com. Again, nonprofitmbapodcast.com. Juan, if anyone wants to get in touch with you, how would they go about doing that?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. So my website is where I hang out and do business. Is DEIProfinder.com. And I'll make sure you have the link to that. I also post a lot on LinkedIn. That's the only social platform I am on. So connect with me and follow me for more on what we discussed today.
Great. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
So I want to thank all of our listeners, not really just for listening. Thank you for that. But for trying to make the world a better place. It is a full-time, high-contact sport. I want to remind you that it is a marathon and a sprint. And because of that, you are no good to your employees, your family, your friends, yourself, if you don't take care of yourself first every day. So what does that mean? I think we all know what that means. You need to get up in the morning and say, okay, what am I going to do today outside of my work that's going to make me happy? And that might be exercise. It might be taking good care of your nutrition. It could be meditating, praying. It could be taking some time with your family. But you need to do that because if you don't do that, it's going to affect everything you do. And so please keep that in mind. It's a great podcast today. I really enjoyed speaking with Juan. I just want to reach everybody.
MBA
a great day.
Is to provide
See you
new
later.
business
Bye.
insights